In this video, we're going to talk about the curves adjustment layer. Now, I want to preface the video by saying that one really could spend many hours talking about various ways in which curves can be applied, caveats for using it as a tool, things to keep in mind. You really could teach an entire little mini class on the curves adjustment in general. My goal here is to show you how it works and then just kind of go from there. So just think of this kind of like as a working reference. Now, I'm going to go ahead and apply a curves adjustment layer to our image once again. This is just the penguins image that is included with Windows 7. If you don't have it, you can use any picture that you like. And I'll just click here in the adjustments panel to drop down a curves adjustment layer. So let's take a quick look at the window. At the very top, we have a series of presets that we can play with, just like many of the other adjustment layers, though I won't be messing with those right now. And then the primary interface of the settings is dominated by a very interesting looking histogram that has a curve laid over it. And I want to take just a minute and talk to you about how this works, because what this is a representation of inputs to outputs, very similar to what you saw in the levels adjustment layer, provided you did watch the video over that. In the levels adjustment layer, you are adjusting the tonal range just by controlling a black point, a white point, and some midtones. So you have those three sliders that you can play with. Here, you have a lot more power because you control a curve which maps the darkest, maps the darkest pixels of the input to the darkest pixels of the output, and the lightest pixels of the input to the lightest pixels of the output. So if you take a look at this graph, running horizontally, we have the input. Running vertically, we have the output. And you see there's a little tiny gradient on the outside just to remind you that the darkest is in the lower left corner and the lightest is in the upper right corner as you move across. Now, a linear relationship, a perfectly straight line, represents no change because that basically means that the input is perfectly matching the output. You can control this relationship by changing the shape of this curve. So for instance, if I was to click directly in the middle on this curve, and start to sweep this down into kind of an ease out relationship, what we're doing is we're taking the darkest pixels of the input and we're mapping them to the darker pixels of the output for a longer amount of time. So that relationship, instead of being linear with a one-to-one change or a slope of 1, is now starting to maintain itself in the darker realm and then sweep up toward the end. And we can actually see that in the image. If you look, as I start to drag this down, the whole image becomes darker. If I go in the opposite direction, now more of the pixels are being mapped toward the brighter end of things with the output, so the image gets lighter. If you're not used to working with curves or playing with curve representations of data, this can be a little bit daunting, but really after you play with it for a while, it's pretty easy to understand. The great thing about it is these curves actually exist in the real world of photography. There are curves that represent how exposures take place on film, how the exposure takes place between the film and the paper. And you can use similar curves to basically represent any kind of film that is possible to shoot a picture on. Now, a typical S-curve, like what I'm creating here, is generally going to boost your contrast because that's keeping your darker pixels darker for longer. So things that were starting to get a little bit brighter have now been pushed back down toward the darker spectrum, and then pixels that were starting to get a little bit darker as you get toward bright have now been pushed back up toward the lighter spectrum of things. So that typical S curve, you can just kind of jot down in your head, is a nice way to increase your contrast. Now I can remove points just by selecting a point and clicking delete. And you can do some pretty kind of off-the-wall things as well. Say, for instance, if I take the darkest color of the input and I map that to the lightest color of the output and then do the inverse over here, I get a negative result. So this is just like a photo negative. Not that I'm saying that's the most practical thing out there, but it is something you can play with if you just happen to need a negative. So this is kind of one way to go about using this this adjustment layer. Now you are not limited to using this on RGB at the same time if you don't want to. You can of course use this on individual channels. So if we're thinking that the blue is a little too intense in the shadows in this case, then actually really it's more intense toward the lighter end of things. But let's just say like these shadows here on the penguins, we think the blue is just a little bit too much. We can start to pull that down just a little bit. So notice I'm putting a point down here toward the darker end of things, and I'm pulling it down to remove some of that blue data. Now this is changing the entire curve, so I will have to put in additional anchor points to straighten the curve back out so that I'm really only adjusting the darker end of things. And there you can see the blue information getting removed. So kind of here's close to where we were, and now there's with some of that blue information gone. Now that does start to cause other interesting things with the colors. We may need to now take a look at perhaps some greens, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of how you can break down individual channel colors and play with that. Also, and I mentioned this in an earlier video, keep in mind that you can also set the blend mode for these adjustment layers as well. So if you want to just adjust the luminosity, you can do that as well. But that's just something that I'll kind of throw out there as a hint. Now, let's go back to RGB, and you can see that I have a separate curve now that represents blue, and then my main curve, which currently represents my RGB values. So all of these curves are unique, and they all work individually from one another. So now I can take my reds, for instance, and you see how in my midtones I have kind of a spike of reds? We can anchor the curve down and then go in the middle and start to pull that down a little bit right there in the midtones. So that's not quite as prevalent. And then if I switch back to RGB, again, you can see the separation starting to take place. So it's definitely the kind of thing that you will need to sort of play with. Now, that's really the first kind of primary way to use the curves adjustment layer. There are several other ways that you can use it as well. For instance, we have the ability to specify a black point, a mid-tone point, or a gray point, and a white point as well. So we could start off there just by click on select black point, grab something that we know should be black, select the gray point, grab something we think should be gray, and select the white point, grab something we think should be white. And notice how all of these spectrum curves are automatically adjusted for us. So it's just another way to go about using it. We can also draw our own curves. So I'm going to switch back over to default to reset everything back to normal. If you click the little pencil tool here, say for instance I mentioned earlier that a typical S-curve kind of boosts contrast, we can draw our very own S-curve as carefully as we can, and there's the result. Now the anchor points for this do get a bit simplified. If we want to simplify any further, we can click the little smooth button down here, and Photoshop will smooth that out for us. So if we drew things and they got a little jaggy because our hand wasn't so steady, we can click the smooth button and smooth those out. So it's just a way, if you know already the shape of the curve that you're looking for, you can jump right in and do this. And I don't want to get too carried away with caveats and rules and regulations and things to keep in mind, but you do really need to watch out for using your curves in RGB mode, just because as you adjust contrast or as you play with this curve, you are really kind of crushing down the overall color density across your entire image, and you can end up kind of posterizing things, meaning that you'll make colors start to have banding, which can be kind of bad. So just watch out for this sort of thing. So there's another way to go about using the tool. We have another one as well, which is pretty nifty. If we switch back over to our little point adjustment mode, so edit points to modify the curve, so there's your button for it, we have the ability to click on a point in the image and use that as a way to push that particular spectrum up and down. So if I click on our little hand button up here, and let's say I want to adjust the midtones, all I have to do is find a point on the image that looks like it should be somewhere near the midtones. And if you're not sure, you can always take a look over in here at the curves adjustment layer, and it'll give you a little circle along your curve to show you about where you are. So somewhere in here is about a nice midtone value. I can just click and drag and bring my midtones up and down just like that. So in effect, I'm adjusting the curve. I'm just going about it in a slightly different way. So I can grab my blacks, and I can pull those up a little bit to lighten those. I can grab my whites and pull those down a little bit. And right now I'm just kind of decreasing the overall sense of contrast in the image, but I'm doing it just by selecting pixels in the image itself and then brightening them or darkening them by dragging up or down respectively. So again, just another way to go about using the tool. Now you can clip off how much of the spectrum you want to use. You have these two sliders at the bottom, And as I start to bring the black point up like so, you'll notice we're using a much shallower range of tones, so things are starting to switch more toward white. I can do the same here, and now we're just really kicking that contrast way up beyond the point of sanity, but we can do that. And just like with the levels adjustment layer, we have the ability to hold down the Alt key and click on the Auto button, and this will bring up our auto color correction options. Now, I did go over these in the levels adjustment layer video, so I will kind of shoot over them real quick here. First off, we have enhanced monochromatic contrast. This is going to identically adjust all of our layers, all of our channels, red, green, and blue, in the same way. So they'll all get adjusted in order to boost our contrast. Enhance per channel is going to do the same thing. It'll boost your contrast, but it'll handle each channel independently. And based on what your original color values were, you may notice that you either lose or gain certain color contrasts or color casts as you do that. So you may find that an image that had a little too much red in it, that either gets fixed, or if there was a vast difference between color channels, you may see a color cast appear. Next, we have Find Dark and Light Colors. This is going to find the darkest and lightest colors in your image and use those to represent the shadows and the highlights. If you combine this with Snap Neutral Midtones, you're basically doing the same thing as the Auto Color command. Now, what Snap Neutral Midtones is going to do is find the closest thing it can find in the image to a true neutral gray or neutral color, and it will snap it to an actual neutral color. So it's just kind of a way to fix any problems. Next, we have the Target Colors and Clipping. For shadows, highlights, and midtones, shadows allows you to choose what color your shadows are going to be. Of course, as you start to brighten that, you lose any blacks in your image. The cool thing about doing this is you can see how this is affecting your curves if you take a look over on the side, and you can see how it affects them in real time. So you can have a lot of fun just watching how changes in your shadow color not only affect the image, but affect that curve output. Then you can choose to clip anything beyond a certain percentage within that particular color. Highlights is the same thing, so we can adjust that as well. And again, you can see it adjusting those curves. As you start to apply colors to these, you can see how that really makes the curves do some interesting things. And then finally, we have midtones, which is kind of like adding a color cast to the image. And this, to me, has probably the most obvious sort of result in terms of what the curves are doing. So there's a quick look at the auto color correction options. I'm going to cancel that. We won't be using that right now. And that is a rundown of the curves adjustment layer. Again, the big thing to keep in mind here is that you're adjusting your color and tonal range by way of an actual curve using multiple anchor points instead of just adjusting the highlights, the lowlights, and the midtones. You now have a lot more control over exactly how that information gets mapped from input to output. It's extremely powerful, and again, just as a reminder of something I said a little while back, one really could spend quite a long time talking about ways in which this can be utilized, caveats and ways that it can bite you if you push things a little too far. But for now, I think this covers the basics of how to go about employing the curves adjustment layer, and it's a good time to maybe jump in and just kind of start playing with it and seeing what you come up with in terms of results. So that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.